How do we know courtly love exists? What's the evidence? Poetry, literature and poetry, more than anything else. So more than anything else we've talked about to this point, this is a strong literary story feeding a cultural transformation. And we'll talk about the cultural transformation here as we get further into our evening. But for now, we want to talk about the elements that make up courtly love. What is it? What does it mean? What is it? Why is it important? Number one, when? There's no question that the great age of courtly love is the 12th century. So from 1100 to 1200, that doesn't mean it ends then. Not at all. No, that's the beginning. That's the fountainhead. That's the moment it comes into being, and that's the moment that Eleanor and her family are so much involved in it. So the origin of it is 12th century, and we talked last week about Eleanor. We're going to talk next week about Abelard and Eloise. So those are 3 weeks on the 12th century. So the 12th century, which is a period with 3 crusades, so one at the beginning, one in the middle, and one at the end. It's also a period with the most important religious reform movement since the early Christian era. And that reform movement is born at the monastery of Cluny, C-L-U-N-Y, which is in Burgundy, and which you can still visit. It's there. And the abbot of Cluny and the monks at Cluny and the work that they do spreads out all over Europe, all over France, all over Germany, all over Britain, all over Italy. And these men who have studied at Cluny go into these other locations and lead reform movements in those locations, and a number of them become pope. So by 1100 and then later, significant popes, individuals who were trained at Cluny, are now reforming the church. What do I mean when I say reform? Well, number one, take this one. Priestly celibacy. Now, some of you naive folks may have thought that priests always were celibate. But that is not true. I hate to disabuse you of your illusions, but that is not true. And from the early church to about the year 1000, the priestly leadership of the Christian church had greatly failed in its attempts to obey priestly celibacy. So by the year 1000, many in the church and outsiders were scandalized by what was happening, where priests would have multiple concubines stashed in various parishes. You know, they'd go to Saint-Étienne, and there'd be one of their little concubine wives with her little children, and then he'd go over here to the other city where he was part-time priest, and he'd have another little concubine with a whole other set of family. So by the year 1000, it was pretty shocking what was going on. The priests were just proliferating, all kinds of little babies everywhere, and multiple wives. And so by the 1000s, many people in the church and many popes said, this should stop. Well, Cluny leads the way, and by 1200, they have stopped it. In other words, from 1000 to 1200, the Christian church, the thousands and thousands of priests and bishops and archbishops, agree that this is not a good idea for priests to have all these lady friends stashed around the countryside. So it comes to an end, more or less, and the papacy and the bishops and the archbishops begin to enforce priestly celibacy, and so the church changes completely. What's the problem with the celibacy? Because if you have all kinds of families, let alone one, you want money for them. You see, that's the problem. It isn't a sex thing. Nobody in the church was worried about the sex stuff. They knew that if priests, who have a very great power, particularly in the last days of a person's life, if priests had families, let alone multiple families, that really made it terrible. But if priests had families, they would become acquisitive for goodies for their wives and their kids. So you didn't want people at the bed of the dying person, whispering in his ear, could I have the farm? Oh, by the way, you're forgiven. Your sins, you're going to be fine in heaven. But could I have the farm on your way out? So that was the worst part of all the priests having families, let alone many families. So that's one reform. Second was selling offices. You see, now I bet everybody in this room can see that that's not a good idea, right? To be selling off offices in the church, right? Right? Aren't we agreed here? But I think we all know that having priests, bishops, and archbishops selling off offices to people was a bad idea. That's called simony, meaning, you're selling church offices. And it was widespread by 1,000. Lots of people were living very well by selling off lots of different offices. So if you're bishop of Paris, you have the opportunity to give a lot of very important offices to other people. And so, if coins would pass underneath the table as you gave it away, you could get quite rich. So that stopped. So there's just two examples. The reform movement, the religious reform movement called Cluniac Reform. And it's a wonderful story. A friend of mine at Stanford wrote a whole book on it, Cluniac Reform. And one of the orders in the 1100s that's important is the Cistercians, led by Bernard of Clairvaux. And then later, as you know, in the later 1100s, there'll be another spectacular leader reformer, Francis of Assisi, 1182. And also, as we just said, Cathar heresy, which arrives in Europe at about the same time. Abelard is a philosopher, another active figure. Eleanor and her husband Henry, and the court of Poitiers. So that's the when. That's the when. Henry and Eleanor are married in 1152, so that's just a good date to use as a sort of a mark for everything in this story. 1152. Where? There's no doubt in the books and the histories and the collections of documents of the poems that it starts in the south, Provençal, southern part of France, South France, and specifically southwest France, and that southwest French culture is later extended, very important point, you know the story last week, so let's just remember, very important point, in the marriage of Eleanor to Henry, an extraordinary thing takes place in that the south of France and the culture that's being created there is carried to London by Eleanor and Henry, and English subjects and English themes and English heroes become caught up in courtly love. So that's a very, very important leap, which we should return to later. But just for now, think of just one story. Just think of one story that is a fascinating courtly love story that's endlessly repeated and retold in any language, German, Italian, French, and it's the story of the Knights of the Round Table, and the story of Guinevere and Lancelot and Arthur, exactly. So all the stories of the Arthurian cycle of stories become attached to courtly love by virtue of Eleanor and Henry marrying. So that's a very, very important part of the story. So as I say there, that the Eleanor story brings together the matter of Britain. That's the way you talk about all the stories around King Arthur. King Arthur, of course, is a story that goes back to the 500s. But here, in 1152, 53, 54, 55, 56, the courtly love world, born in Eleanor's court, is carried to London and married to the stories of the matter of Britain, that is Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot. And the story and the series of stories are so perfect for the courtly love imagery that this becomes the most popular story in all the courtly love literature. Doesn't matter whether you're in Germany, doesn't matter whether you're in France, doesn't matter if you're in Italy. Everyone loved the story of Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot. And we still do. So now let's move to the who. And the who is William of Aquitaine, Duke William of Aquitaine, his son William X, his granddaughter Eleanor, their great-grandchildren, particularly King Richard the Lionhearted, and then, of course, great-great. So this will continue all the way through, both in France, in the royal family of France, and the royal family of England, and think of the county of Champagne, where the counts of Champagne are the descendants of Marie of Champagne. And so this whole courtly love culture that she creates in her capital city of Troyes will be handed along to to other places and other times. And that culture of the county of Champagne in the city of Troyes, the capital city of Troyes, produces the single greatest writer of all courtly love literature, and his name is Chrétien de Troyes. In other words, Christian of Troyes. Chrétien de Troyes, Troyes, Chrétien de Troyes, who writes a series of novels, short novels. We don't call them novels because it's before the invention of novels, so short stories about Lancelot, Arthur, Guinevere. He's in France, he's in Champagne, he's in Troyes, and he's writing the stories about Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot because he knows everybody loves those stories better than anybody else. So there's a great example of how this is transnational, how it's international. So that's the who. Number 3, the who. Of course, it spreads, so we all understand that. So although the creative center is southwestern France, Bordeaux, Poitiers, Eleanor and her family, the implications go on for generations and generations and generations into all the other countries. So there's poetry in Scotland, there's poetry in northern Germany, there's poetry in Scandinavia, yes, even Scandinavia, in that freezing cold Scandinavia, they like courtly love. So it doesn't matter, it goes all over Europe, and by the time of Dante, and keep that in your mind now, remember we're coming to him in a few weeks, so keep that in your mind. By the time of Dante, 1300, courtly love is the single most powerful theme in the literature of Europe by 1300. So in 200 years, courtly love comes to dominate the literature of Western Europe. Number 4, feudalism. You all know what feudalism is. It is a social structure that evolves in Europe in the 600s, 700s, 800s, 900s, after the fall of Rome. It's a way of organizing society in the moment of the collapse of the organizing unity of the Roman Empire. People have to find some other way, and the way they find is the feudal structure where the lowest level peasant works the land and gives his superior some part of it. The superior reports to some higher figure, maybe a baron, and gives to him some part of it, and the baron then reports to the count, and he gives to the count some part of it every month or whatever, and then the count reports to, is loyal to, does obeisance on his knees in front of the duke, and the duke reports to, does obeisance on his knees in front of the king. So that's the hierarchical structure of feudal Europe, 800, 900, 1000, in which everyone stays pretty much in their level, and it serves to create peace, unity, economic structure, military structure, defensive posture to keep out the barbarians. That's what it's for. Now, courtly love is part of the feudal world. And it is part of the feudal world for a very simple reason. Number 1, you have a society of knights. You have a society in which the horse is the most important possession that a man has, and if he's a knight or higher, he has a horse. So that sets him apart. The hierarchical structure of the society, the feudal society, is at the center of it a fighting knight with a horse. That's chivalry. The very word horse is what chivalry comes from. And the feudal structure of 12th century Europe creates a huge number of unoccupied knights sitting around at home in between crusades. In other words, there's this huge organization of knights to go off and fight. That means people are provided with horses, people are provided with weapons. This huge mobilization 3 times, so the beginning and the middle and the end, that lasts 10 years or more. And in each case then, when the crusade is over, whether they won anything or not doesn't make any difference. Most of the time they didn't win anything, but didn't matter because they all had a lot of fun, you know. They would come home and sit around and not have anything to do. So what you created was a society of a great deal of movement and dislocation and social dislocation. And so that's exactly what you get. The courtly love culture is born in this world of knights going away to the crusade, coming back from the crusade, and the influence of women, the importance of women and in leadership positions, and the relationship between feudal society, feudal marriage, and any idea of love. Now, as I say here in the notes, any idealization of love, the emotion of love, the erotic emotion of being madly in love, any literature about that, any idealization of that, any kind of praising of how wonderful that is ipso facto, we'll throw in a little Latin here, by its very nature, adulterous. Because in the feudal structure, marriages are feudal contracts between families. They have nothing to do with passion or whether Johnny wants to marry Mary or whether Johnny loves Mary or whether Mary loves Johnny or any of that. It has nothing to do with that. In this very stable structure, this very solidified, this very hierarchical structure, all that matters is daughter of Blau marries the son of Auvergne, and the mama and the dad, they're happy, and bang, you bring the two counties together. That was feudal, early medieval marriage. Had nothing to do with love. Now, if you produce a massive outpouring of literature that celebrates love in its erotic, exciting, perfect state, you are singing songs praising adultery. It was implied, it was obvious, it was automatic, it was clear to everybody. Do you get it? Do you all get it? You get it? If marriages are nothing to do with love, but everything to do with the structure of the family property, they're contracts of property holders. That's why what the marriage is for. It had always been that way. You can go back to Rome, it's the same thing. You go back to Greece, it's the same thing. It's always been that way. But here, all of a sudden, in the 12th century, we get this huge explosion of poetry celebrating the passion of love. And therefore, right to start with, when we talk about tonight, realize, everybody here, that everybody understood this emotion that Bernard de Ventadorn was praising for its power was praising non-marital love, because that didn't have anything to do with why people got married. You get it? Everybody's with me? So, what you have then is this crash together in the 1100s of the quest for stable property relationships, stable counts and countesses and dukes and duchesses, stable in their lives, getting married, staying married, and the creative ferment of poetry praising the power of love. Powerful, erotic, sexy, hot love. The idealization of love in a society of arranged marriages is necessarily an idealization of adulterous love. I'm reading myself. Number 4. That's the feudal aspect of this. That is, we're living in a society which is still a feudal society, which is not yet the exploding urban world of Europe of Dante 200 years later. This is a landed-based society where dukes and duchesses get married to create a larger land-holding territory and hope that they can give their children the same.